take a slow, deep breath and imagine yourself drifting far back in time, across vast oceans and endless waves, to a distant edge of the world. Tonight, you will journey to the windswept shores of early Australia, when this land was not yet the thriving cities and sunlit beaches we know today, but instead a lonely outpost for the condemned. As you settle into your pillow, let the quiet rhythm of this forgotten history lull you. Picture the creaking timbers of ships at sea, the hush of wind through eucalyptus groves, and the faint echo of footsteps across rough stone yards. In this story, you are not an explorer or a governor, but an ordinary convict, one among hundreds sent across the world to carve a settlement out of wilderness. Their days were long, their nights restless, their lives a constant struggle between hope and despair. You will follow their footsteps, wake with them at dawn, feel the weight of chains, hear the distant sea as they swing axes, shape new roads, and dream of freedom that might never come. And as you listen, allow the steady cadence of their words. Imagine yourself waking in the dim belly of a creaking ship, the first fleet, still at anchor off a shore that seems to shimmer in the morning heat. You lie on rough planks, surrounded by the slow rustle and soft coughing of others who, like you, have spent months in this dark hold. The air is thick with salt, sweat, and the faint, sour temps of the sea. Above you, boots thud along the deck. A sharp bark from a guard reminds you that today is not a day for dreaming. It is a day for labor, and for a convict there is only labor, sunup to sundown. You climb the narrow ladder, blinking in the sudden light. The shore stretches out before you, a sweep of rough bush, tangled scrub, and the promise of endless work beneath a burning sky. Nearby, fellow prisoners gather rough tools, axes dull. Imagine now that before the clearing of forests, before the scraping of boots in sandy soil, there was the sea, a vast, endless plain of salt and wind, stretching from the crowded docks of Portsmouth all the way to the unknown coastlines of Terra Australis. Picture yourself standing on the deck of one of those first ships, the air damp with brine, sails snapping above you in the restless Atlantic winds. The year is 1787, and the first fleet, 11 ships in all, is about to slip its moorings and point its bows toward the edge of any map an Englishman had yet trusted. Below decks, you feel every roll and pitch of the hull. The air down here is thick, close, carrying the sourness of unwashed bodies pressed together for weeks at a time. Hammocks sway gently, creaking like soft whispers in the dark. Some convicts mumble in sleep, others lie awake, counting the days by the shifting of the lantern that swings above the companionway. Above, the sailors call to one another, low voices lost in the wind that rattles ropes and hums in the rigging. The sea itself is never still. One moment calm as beaten pewter, the next black ridges heaving beneath a pale, cold sky. When you are allowed on deck, you feel the sudden shock of fresh air. It tastes sharp, salted, bracing after the stale dark below. You squint against the spray, clutching the rail as waves slap the hull. If you are lucky, you might catch sight of the wake trailing behind. A white path to nowhere, slowly erased by the sea. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. The fleet picks its way down the African coast to Tenerife and Cape Verde, where ships pause to take on casks of fresh water, salted meat, sacks of biscuit crawling with weevils. Then onward again, into the long reach of the Atlantic, where the horizon circles endlessly, and storms lash the rigging until canvas tears like old cloth. Men sicken in the holds. Some die quietly in hammocks that sway side by side with the living. Others grow thinner, their eyes hollow, hands trembling as the rationed water dwindles between ports. The ship's surgeon makes his rounds by lantern light, tallying the fevers, the coughs that echo louder in the hush of the deep-sea nights. At each sunrise, the deck hums with the same rhythm. Sailors working ropes with calloused hands, officers measuring the sky with brass instruments, convicts standing in line for their meager portions, salt pork, hardtack, perhaps a sip of watered rum if the captain is kind. You share glances with your fellows, wondering who will see the strange new shore and who will remain forever beneath the waves. When the fleet crosses the equator, the air grows hot and heavy. Tar bubbles on deck. Below, the hold feels like a kill. The stench is sharp. Sweat, brine, mildew. Hammocks drip with condensation. Rats scurry in the dark, bold and fat, slipping between barrels of bread and casks of beer. Then the ships swing south again, riding the trade winds toward the Cape of Good Hope. Last chance to touch known land before the emptiness resumes. Here, sailors scrub decks and patch sails torn by gales. Convicts are brought up for fresh air, legs trembling on the planks after so many weeks confined. Some are so weak they cannot stand without help. When the fleet rounds the Cape at last, it enters the roughest stretch of all. The Southern Ocean waits, restless, frigid, roaring with winds that circle the globe unbroken. Here, the ships are tossed like driftwood, timbers groaning in protest, masts straining under frozen rigging. Some pray, others simply endure. There is no turning back. And then, almost by miracle, the winds soften, the swell eases, and the lookout cries land. A strip of cliffs, pale in dawn light, sand dunes, scattered bush, a strange, wild coast that has waited unbothered for centuries. After 252 days at sea, the first fleet drops anchor in Botany Bay, only to find it too shallow, too exposed to the ocean's moods. So the ships drift a little further north, to a small cove where the water is calmer, the shore more forgiving, a place soon to be called Sydney Cove. Imagine the moment you step off the ship, legs unsteady, eyes blinking at the bright sun, the sudden chatter of birds you do not know. Behind you lies half a world of rolling water. Ahead, dense forests, the smoke of early fires, and the endless work of carving a home where none yet exists. So the voyage ends, but the longest journey of all, the one on this strange shore, is only just beginning. And for a convict stepping off that creaking gangplank, the thought comes quietly, like a last gust of sea breeze. Freedom lies further than any horizon you have ever seen. When you picture those first years in this new land, you might imagine endless forests, sweating convicts, and hungry nights under makeshift tents. But if you listen closely, you might also hear the quiet clink of glass bottles, the low rumble of barrels being rolled ashore, and the murmured dealings that would come to define power in the early colony. It is a truth often forgotten that in those first fragile decades, rum was not merely a drink, it was a currency, a bribe, a bracing comfort, and the quiet fuel for rebellion. Imagine yourself now not as a convict swinging an axe, but as a watchful figure standing in the narrow lane behind the officers' quarters. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint sweetness of spilled spirits seeping into the ground. It is the early 1800s, and the colony clings to the edge of the Great Bay. Official coins are scarce here. There are no proper banks yet, no steady trickle of gold or silver from Britain. Instead, rum flows where coins do not. Soldiers are paid in it. Merchants hoard it in barrels stacked behind locked doors. Farmers trade it for tools or livestock. Some say the new settlement is built as much on rum as on the back-breaking labor of those in chains. At the center of this quiet commerce stands the New South Wales Corps, a regiment of red-coated soldiers, nicknamed the Rum Corps for good reason. They do not simply guard the settlement. They control its trade. They ration the casks. They decide whose cup is filled and whose debts deepen drop by drop. In the middle of this fragile balance arrives William Bligh, a man already infamous for the mutiny that once tossed him from his own ship, the Bounty, into an open boat on a wide Pacific Sea. He comes to Sydney not as a sea captain this time, but as governor, charged with bringing order to a place that has learned to bend rules as easily as saplings in the wind. Bligh sees the power the Corps wields through its rum monopoly and moves to break it. He tries to ban the use of spirits as currency. He forbids the barter that feeds the secret taverns hidden between rough huts and storehouses. He confiscates private stills. He fines, punishes, and lectures, determined to wrest control back into official hands. But this far from London, power does not always obey the neat lines on a governor's parchment. The officers push back, politely at first, then more boldly. They mock his orders, skirt his bans, trade barrels under cover of darkness. Tensions gather like distant thunder. Picture, then, that January day in 1808, the day the rum barrels and quiet whispers tip into open revolt. Redcoats march down the narrow track that winds towards Government House. They come with drums muffled but muskets loaded. At their head rides Major George Johnston, resolute and calm. A man who knows this far shore answers to power, not parchment. Inside, Bligh tries to bar the door, but resistance is futile in this small, raw outpost. They find him hiding, some say, behind a bed, a last attempt to escape the force gathering in his yard. He is placed under arrest, a governor deposed not by distant rebels, but by the very men sent to guard his authority. This quiet coup becomes known as the Rum Rebellion, the only military overthrow of government in Australia's history. And when the dust settles, power stays just where the Corps wants it, wrapped in barrels, measured by the cup, passed hand to hand through lonely bush taverns and down creaking ship gangways. The rebellion would echo for years. London would send new governors, new orders, new threats of punishment for those who defied the Crown's fragile hold. But on these sandy shores, far from Parliament's polished floors, rum would remain, the hidden currency that softened long nights, eased hunger, and bought the loyalty of men who carved new roads through a land that cared little for their rules. So, as you drift deeper into this quiet past, imagine the soft slosh of barrels in the hold of a ship at anchor, the hush of coins that never came, and the taste of rum on the tongue of men who built a colony drop by drop and defied a king with nothing but courage, silence, and the oldest vice of all. Imagine, now, that beyond the rough convict huts and the muddy forest clearings, there stands a house unlike the rest, larger, better built, with floors of sawn timber instead of packed earth, and windows that look out across the slow curve of Sydney Cove here. The rumble of axes and the murmur of chains soften into the quiet clink of cutlery and low, careful conversation. Step inside the governor's residence as dusk settles and the bush hums with insects beyond the garden fence. Inside, a long table is laid rough by London's standards, yet fine enough here in this edge of the world colony. Plates of pewter, cups of thin china, knives brought carefully across months of ocean travel. A candle flickers in a draught, its flame bending above the remains of a meal that tastes faintly of two distant worlds meeting in one place. At the head of the table sits the governor, perhaps Arthur Phillip in the first harsh years, or later, William Bligh himself before the rebellion's quiet footsteps crossed this threshold. He leans back in a straight-backed chair, his coat hung carefully over the armrest, shirt sleeves rolled in the humid coastal air. Before him, plates bear the traces of salt pork, boiled beef, fresh fish, if the cove's nets were kind, perhaps even kangaroo roasted over an open hearth. A bottle of claret, carefully uncorked, sits alongside a jug of water drawn from a nearby spring. Each sip is a small luxury in a place where fresh water must be fetched by hand, drop by drop, from streams that dry without warning. Around him, officers in plain uniforms share quiet words about tomorrow's supply ships. Will they bring grain enough to stretch the rations? Will more convicts arrive? Will new tools come to replace those blunted by endless try-felling? Conversation drifts easily to England letters, half-finished on cramped desks. Rumors of politics in London drawing men who command here back home, if only in thought. Yet even in this gentler circle of oil lamps and cloth napkins, the hush of the bush creeps close. Outside the walls, a garden struggles, neat rows of imported vegetables fighting poor soil and a climate that obeys no familiar seasons. Chickens cluck in coops behind the kitchen house, their feathers brushed by wind from the bay. Servants pass in and out, some free settlers, others convicts trusted enough to carry dishes, fill cups, and clear plates without fear of sudden theft. The conversation is polite, the food plain by Europe's standard, yet this small ritual of linen, glass, and soft voices is an anchor of order in a settlement where order so easily frays. Here, at this table, the governor reminds himself and his officers that the king's presence is more than a name on parchment. It is carried in each carefully portioned meal, each measured sip, each word spoken in steady calm. Beyond the shuttered windows, a distant shout reminds them that not every soul here sleeps with a full belly or a full cup. Outside the fence, the dark hush of the bush remains vast, waiting, patient, indifferent to the ranks and coats that divide governor from prisoner. And as candles burn low, the governor pushes back from the table, takes up his pen, and drafts reports that will cross oceans, slow messengers of hope, complaint, ambition, all tied to this strange place where each meal must be earned, each day measured against the forest's relentless edge. So imagine yourself drifting now from the warmth of the table, out through the garden gate, into the hush of eucalypts and the soft rustle of nightbirds. The table fades behind you, a small island of civility in a wide, indifferent land as you move onward to the stories waiting beyond its flickering light. Now, drift further inland, away from the guarded clearing and the faint glow of the governor's house. Beyond the well-worn tracks that curl around Sydney Cove, follow the faint path of footsteps pressed into sandy soil, leading you deeper into the hush of the bush where shadows gather under the moon. Here, in the tangled scrub and ghost gums, another life flickers at the colony's edge, the hidden world of the bushrangers, men who slipped their chains and vanished into the wild, choosing the peril of freedom over the certainty of another sunrise in irons. Picture yourself crouched beside a low fire beneath a canopy of branches. The flame is small, carefully banked with stones, its glow dulled by leaves to avoid the searching eyes of troopers on patrol. Around you, rough blankets are spread over damp ground. A battered tin pot rests in the coals, hissing gently as water boils for weak tea. A man sits opposite you, coat patched, boots worn near through. He holds a battered pistol close at hand. Old, perhaps unreliable, but better than none when the law rides too near. His eyes flick between the shadows, measuring each sound of a night bird or the distant crack of a branch under a possum's tread. By day, he is ghost and rumor, slipping between gullies, hiding in rocky caves, stealing bread and salted meat from lonely farmsteads. By night, he is a story that passes between convict huts like an ember, the tale of a man who would not swing an axe for another's wealth, but would vanish into the trees, rifle at his shoulder, boots silent on dry leaves. You sip the tin cup he offers. The tea is thin, but warm enough to settle the ache that creeps into bones after a day spent moving through rough country. The scent of burning eucalyptus drifts upward in lazy spirals. Somewhere not far off, a creek murmurs over stones, a hidden track of silver beneath the moon. These men, and sometimes women, were thieves, outlaws, rebels in a land already carved from punishment. Some were cruel, some desperate, some became legends, woven into ballads sung in low voices by convicts around their fires. They robbed the drays that rumbled along bush tracks. They lifted coins and salt pork from outlying farms. They traded stolen goods for whispers of safe routes through thick scrub and sandstone ridges. Yet their freedom was never easy. The bush gives shelter, but little mercy. Food must be hunted, traps set by starlight, snares checked by dawn. A single slip of boot or careless trail of smoke brings the mounted troopers, men who know these gullies well and follow the crack of a branch or the flicker of ash like hounds on a scent. So tonight, the bushranger keeps his voice low, his pistol close, his eyes sharp even as he leans against the trunk of a scribbly gum. You feel the weight of the forest around you, the creak of branches overhead, the restless insects, the echo of a distant dingo's cry carried on the breeze. Here, beyond the reach of the governor's neat table and the clink of pewter cups, freedom is raw and restless. It comes with the constant worry of capture, the bite of cold rain without a roof, the uneasy thrill of living by your own rules in a land that respects few of them. As the fire sinks to glowing embers, you pull the rough blanket tighter around your shoulders. Tomorrow, the outlaw will move again, deeper into the hills, or perhaps down to the track where wagons carry flour and rum and letters from the far world you left behind. For now, you close your eyes beneath the branches. The forest hums around you, and somewhere far off, the guarded clearing sleeps on. Now, drift your thoughts south, far from the quiet rebel fires, hidden in the New South Wales bush. across the restless sea that curls cold and gray around an island once known as Van Diemen's Land. Here lies Port Arthur, a settlement more prison than town, more warning than refuge. Its name spoken in hushed tones by convicts who knew that a sentence here was not just punishment, but a place that tested the very edges of hope. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the settlement, the southern ocean sighing beyond ragged cliffs. The wind carries a chill even in summer, sharp with salt and the faint tang of wet stone walls. Above you rise rows of brick and sandstone buildings, cell blocks, workshops, the silent chapel where whispers gather in vaulted beams. If you listen, you can almost hear the clink of chains echoing through narrow passageways, the faint shuffle of boots on stone, the low cough of men lined in rows before dawn muster, each marked by numbers, not names. In Port Arthur, life moves to the rhythm of iron and discipline. Men rise before sunrise, the frost still clinging to earth and roofs. They stand in silent lines, eyes down, waiting for orders. Some will be marched to the quarries at the edge of the forest, picks in hand, shaping rock for the colony's roads and walls. Others will haul timber through misty gullies, cold sap sticking to rough shirts. A few, trusted or skilled enough, labor in workshops, blacksmiths striking sparks from iron, carpenters planing planks for ships or rough furniture that fills the governor's quarters far away. Even here, under watchful eyes, the threat of punishment lies always at the shoulder. A word out of turn, a tool misplaced, a moment of idleness paid for with hours in the solitary cell. Imagine now the solitary, a single room, stone walls thick enough to hush any voice, a narrow slot of light that catches dust in a cold shaft. Some cells keep even silence inside them, men hooded, footsteps muffled, forced to live in a hush so deep it presses at the edges of thought. For some, it breaks the mind more surely than any iron chain ever could. Yet life in Port Arthur was not only punishment. There were gardens where trusted men grew vegetables to feed the settlement's rows of rough-bellied mouths. There were fields where sheep grazed under sharp-edged guards. There was a schoolhouse, too, where boys sent for petty theft or vagrancy bent over chalk slates, learning letters while iron shackles hung loose at their ankles. At night, the wind moves through eucalypt groves, and the mists roll down from the hills. In small wooden huts, guards doze beside oil lamps, rifles propped within reach. The sea waits beyond, always the last and cruelest wall. Cold channels and rocky bays that make escape a test few survive. Yet try they did. Tales of men slipping into the brush, guided by moonlight and the hush of the forest. Some hid in hollow logs or under piles of brush, waiting for patrols to pass. A handful managed to steal small boats, pushing out into the black swells with oars cut from rough timber and prayers whispered into salt spray. Most were caught. A few vanished forever, becoming another rumor traded between cell walls and quarry stones. Tonight, if you stand at the edge of Port Arthur, you might imagine the soft rattle of those chains long stilled. The stone ruins that remain hold the stories like breath between their walls, murmuring reminders of men who chipped at rock and hope alike, who dreamed of the distant bush as they walked the line between submission and survival. And as the southern ocean sighs beyond the cliffs, you drift with it, away from Port Arthur's cold stones and watchful towers. into the quiet bush where shadows gather secrets, and tomorrow always waits. Just now, drift your thoughts away from the cold stones of Port Arthur's prison walls. Let the sea's sigh fade behind you as you travel inland once more, to a place whose name carries a softer shape but no softer truth, the female factory. Imagine low buildings of rough brick built behind high wooden palings. They stand on the edge of a river or a scrubby hill, depending on where the settlement took root, Parramatta, Hobart, or further still. Here the word factory does not mean chimneys and iron gears, but rows of washtubs, piles of unwashed linen, and the constant rhythm of women's hands at work. Picture yourself stepping through the tall gates as dawn breaks. The air is cool, the scent of wet stone mixed with soap and smoke from cook fires still smoldering from the night before. Inside, women stand in long lines, rows of skirts and bonnets faded by salt air and endless sun. Some cradle infants on their hips. Others bend over buckets, water sloshing against wooden sides as they scrub shirts and sheets that once lay on the governor's table or the warder's cot. For many, this is where the journey ended after the first fleet, or where a second sentence began. Theft, drunkenness, disobedience. The female factory swallowed them all. Some came directly from Britain's courts, their passage marked by whispered rumors of petty crimes or stubborn defiance. Others were born here, daughters of convicts who never saw England's cliffs again. In the laundry rooms, steam curls through narrow windows. Rough soap stings the hands and the eyes. Water drips from skirts onto stone floors, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Beyond the laundry lie the yards, fenced spaces where women wait for work, for meals, for the small chances that might change everything. Some dream of marriage, a ticket out, offered by settlers or soldiers in need of a wife to tend a hut on the edge of the bush. Some hold children close and wish for softer days. Others bend quietly to rules they never wrote, hoping to earn a ticket of leave, permission to work for wages, to buy small freedoms a shilling at a time. But there is laughter here too, low and wary, sometimes sharp, secrets passed in whispers, a quiet barter of news or favors. In corners, rough scraps of cloth are sewn into hidden pockets, a stolen loaf or bottle hidden away against the rules that watch every move. At night, the gates close tight. Guards pace the fence line by lantern light. Inside, women sleep in long barracks, bodies close for warmth when the wind rattles the shutters. Infants fuss in the dark, soothed by soft murmurs. In sleep, some drift back across the sea in dreams, to London streets, to the rough comfort of alleys and markets, to families left behind. Outside the fence, the world turns. Soldiers on patrol, settlers carving paddocks from the bush, convicts swinging axes by the light of dawn. But inside the female factory, the days pass in a quiet churn of soap and cloth and muffled hope. Sometimes a name is called. A woman steps through the gates, her hair pinned neat, her eyes cast low, led away to a small marriage in a wooden church or a farm cottage waiting days away by cart. Sometimes she never returns, sometimes she does. And so the gates close again, the tubs fill again. The hush of footsteps over stone carries onward, carrying stories that drift down through generations, soft as steam, stubborn as soap on raw hands, quiet as breath behind tall wooden walls. Close your eyes now and imagine the hush before any ship's sail rose on the horizon, long before the creak of convict carts and the clink of iron chains, long before the governor's table gleamed with pewter plates and salt pork, long before any name called Sydney or Port Arthur was written on a map. Imagine, instead, a land shaped by ancient footsteps, crisscrossed by pathways, not paved in stone, but marked by memory and the slow patience of countless generations. These were the song lines, trails of meaning, stories carried through the bush, the coasts, the riverbeds, weaving families, spirits, and seasons together. Picture a bend in a river where tall gums lean out over water, thick with the hum of insects. A child's footprints press softly in the mud. A cooking fire sends a thin thread of smoke into the early dawn, mixing with the scent of fish roasting over coals. The people here know every bend in this river, every patch of reed that hums with frog song, every tree whose bark can be coaxed into a canoe with quiet skill. When the first fleet arrived, sails white against a bright sky, these people watched from the shoreline, curious, wary, voices hushed. Canoes slipped through the shallows as figures stood in the shadows of bankside trees, wondering what new spirit had crossed the waves. At first, there was wonder, strange clothes, glittering metal blades, bottles of strong drink that bit at the tongue. Gifts were offered, sometimes with genuine goodwill, sometimes with the quiet calculation of men who knew trade as power. For a moment, the pathways of the old world and the new crossed like threads woven into a fragile fabric. But soon the fabric strained. The newcomers cut trees for timber, fenced hunting grounds, tethered sheep where kangaroo once roamed free, sacred fishing coves filled with the slap of oars and the hiss of sand piled into banks for rough new huts, rivers clouded with silt and the dust of cartwheels. For the people who belonged to this land, whose ancestors had walked the same trails for countless seasons, this was no distant history lesson. It was the slow hush of loss, spoken in the creak of axes and the clatter of pots, in fences where once there were only tracks. Some chose to move further inland, following the old pathways into forests that might still offer quiet. Others stayed near, watching, working when pressed or tempted by flour and tobacco, or simply enduring as watchers of a world that shifted under their feet. Conflict flickered at the edges, not always open battles, but quiet moments of resistance. Spears against musket barrels, burning huts under moonlight, footprints vanishing into gullies no map could pin down. Yet, through it all, the old pathways endured, whispered from grandparent to grandchild, painted in ochre on cave walls that the new settlers rarely saw, carried in songs murmured by fires far from the clearings of the convict camps. Tonight, as you drift further into this layered hush, imagine the brush bending under a passing figure whose name you may never know, a child or elder who sees no boundary between the shadows of the gum trees and the soft tracks of possums and people alike. Even now, long after the first sails vanished over the horizon, those stories linger, softer than wind in the trees, patient as the land itself. And so you rest here a while, between two worlds that met on a salt shore, listening to the hush of the bush, the hush of time, the hush that speaks even when history tries to silence it. Now imagine the coast, not the safe, sandy curve of Sydney Cove, or the calm slip of rivers through settlements, but the wild places where the land meets the sea with a raw edge. Picture jagged reefs hidden just beneath green breakers, sharp teeth of stone waiting to tear open a ship's belly when the wind shifts in the dark. For those early convict ships and the traders that followed, the sea was never a promise, only a gamble. The same ocean that carried prisoners from the distant northern world could turn cold and cruel in an instant, shattering timbers, scattering barrels and crates across a rocky shore. Imagine, for a moment, standing barefoot on damp sand. A storm has passed, leaving driftwood and splinters tangled with seaweed. Nearby, a hull lies broken on its side, half buried by the rising tide. Some wrecks came suddenly, storms that gathered like fists, winds that pressed masts to the water. Crews heaved ropes and prayed by lantern light, while the waves pounded decks already slick with spray. Some were pushed by poor charts and rough guesses, sailing blindly toward reefs that showed no mercy. One by one, the coast claimed them. The Batavia dashed on coral far to the west, her survivors tangled in mutiny and quiet murder on lonely islands. The Sydney Cove wrecked off Tasmania's wild shores, her desperate crew and passengers trudging barefoot through scrub and marsh, some vanishing into hunger and salt wind. When a ship foundered, its people stepped ashore, dazed. Convicts, sailors, officers alike, suddenly equal in the hush of survival. They faced the same freezing nights, the same uncertain chance that rescue might come or vanish like a gull on the horizon. For some, the wreck was a cruel end to a sentence that already felt endless. For others, it was an unexpected chance, a window to slip into the bush, to trade the watchful eye of a captain for the silent patience of gum trees and hidden tracks. Coastal settlers spoke of finding wreckage after storms, barrels cracked open to spill rum across white sand, crates of boots and cloth tangled in seaweed, the quiet, sad ghosts of ships too stubborn to sink all at once. Some scavenged what they could, nails, timber, and some wrecks never left at all. They lingered half-buried on beaches, their ribs rising at low tide like the bones of forgotten giants. Children playing in rock pools years later found rusted nails, shards of pottery, sometimes a coin blackened by salt. If you stand on one of those wind-swept beaches now, far from any town's glow, you can still hear the hush of waves pressing at the shore, telling stories in a language older than any ship's log. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes it leaves them scattered where the tide can reach. A plank of oak worn smooth as driftwood, a ghostly mast tilting under the moon, a reminder that even the strongest hull bows to the endless pull of the sea. So let yourself drift a little longer with that hush, the hush of wind and salt spray, the hush that settled over men and women who stepped ashore with empty hands. Follow the rough roads that coil through the bush, where tall gums sway and the dirt tracks are carved by boots and wagon wheels alike. Along these winding paths, hope took a shape as humble as a scrap of paper, a promise that some chains could loosen, if only a little. It was no pardon, it was no full freedom, but it was permission to step just a little outside the iron boundaries of the barracks and stockades. Picture yourself now, standing in the line that snakes before a low wooden office at the edge of the settlement. The sun presses hot through your rough shirt. Your boots, if you have them at all, pinch your feet raw after miles of clearing roads or hacking stumps from stubborn clay. When your name is called, you step forward, hat in hand. A clerk with ink-stained fingers glances at your face, matches it to the list. He asks your crime, your conduct. He weighs a word whispered by your overseer. Steady worker, no trouble, sober when watched. And if fortune leans kindly for once, he scratches out your name in a new column. You walk away with a folded slip that rustles in your pocket with every step. A ticket of leave did not set you free. It gave you boundaries. A district you could not leave without permission. Wages you could earn under watchful eyes. You might be allowed to build a small hut at the fringe of a town. Marry if you could find a willing hand. Plant a rough garden in soil you did not own. You worked for settlers and merchants, hauling bricks, mending roofs, tending sheep that were never yours to claim. Yet within these small limits, life changed. You could taste meat more often than salt pork alone. You could bargain for cloth, mend your boots, carry a few coins to a quiet tavern when the day's work was done. Some found enough trust to open small shops, to teach trades learned in cellars and stables far across the sea. But the ticket was fragile, like a candle guttering in the wind. A quarrel in a tavern, a stolen loaf when wages fell short, a lie told to a watchful constable. Any slip and the parchment turned worthless. The slip was torn, the irons brought back, the road gangs waiting again with their dull axes and restless guards. Still, for many, the ticket was a thread worth holding tight. It carried a man from iron to a measure of dignity, from a cot in the barracks to a rough table in a hut he could almost call his own. For a woman, it might mean a steady ration of flour for her children. An evening without the watchful eye of a matron at the factory gates. Sign their names freely, no longer counted as cargo in the ledgers that crossed oceans. Picture that slip of paper folded in a rough pocket, a promise that tomorrow might not always echo with chains, that a hard-earned garden, a quiet cup of tea, a child safe in a warm corner might be waiting when the sun rises again. Now follow the thread of the ticket of leave back to where hope was still only a rumor, back to the roads themselves. Those endless tracks that crawled through bush and scrub, over hills and riverbeds, were not born from the earth by magic. They were chipped, hacked, leveled, and beaten into shape by men who moved in rows, bound not just by orders, but by the iron links that rattled softly with every step. Picture a chain gang at dawn. The air is still cool, the mist clinging low over eucalyptus groves and distant paddocks. Men stand in line, boots crusted in dried mud, ankles shackled in pairs by iron cuffs that bite if they lag behind. Each man holds a spade or a mattock, its handle worn smooth by countless blisters, before his own hands gripped it. A constable watches from horseback, musket slung across his shoulder. He calls the roll by name and number, a reminder that here a man's name matters less than the tally in the ledger that notes every swing of the pick, every stone prized from stubborn clay. The work begins with a dull rhythm, thud, scrape, lift, drop. The men clear brush first, saplings hacked at their base, branches dragged aside to dry under the sun's climbing heat. Then they break the soil, lifting the earth with slow, aching strokes, shaping a rough track that might one day carry wagons, cattle, officers on patrol. Some gangs dig drainage ditches to keep the road dry in sudden rains. Others hammer loose stones into place, one after another, until the track holds steady under hoof and wheel. There is no comfort here, no soft bed waiting at dusk. Only a rough camp where men huddle close under canvas. The night air filled with the restless rustle of chains when someone shifts too sharply in sleep. In the day's hush, broken only by the calls of cockatoos in high branches, a man's thoughts drift where they can. Some think of streets back in London or Dublin, of alehouses warm with noise, of cobblestones under boots that never knew iron's bite. Others picture only the next dawn, how to hold the tool just so, how to keep the iron from chafing raw skin, how to keep a little strength for the next ridge to cross. The chain gang's road was more than just a path for carts. It was the lifeline of the new colony, joining stockades to farms, coastal towns to inland clearings. Each fresh mile carved into the land made escape harder, but also stitched scattered settlements together. The very men who might dream of slipping away into the bush helped build the tracks that brought patrols ever closer. Sometimes passing settlers left food or words tossed over a fence, a heel of bread, a strip of salt meat, a moment's kindness to men who might once have stolen from their doorsteps back home. Other times, only silence, eyes averted as they passed the line of tired men who bent their backs to a land that gave nothing freely. At dusk, the road falls quiet. Picks and spades lean against tree trunks. Boots shuffle back to camp. The chains clink low in the evening hush, a sound that lingers like a ghost among the gums. Fires spark in shallow pits, tea boiled black and bitter in tin pots. Laughter drifts now and then, harsh, brief, a scrap of memory passed among the rows. Above, the southern stars appear one by one, cold pinpricks over the wild country that still holds more secrets than any map can claim. And lying awake on the hard ground, a man might watch the slow drift of the night sky, dream of a road that leads somewhere far beyond the reach of iron and order, a road only he could follow, if he could just slip the chains, hush for good. As darkness settles thicker among the trees, the small fires flicker like faint stars fallen to earth. Around them, men crouch close, knees pulled tight to chest, hands cupped around tin mugs that rattle softly against iron cuffs whenever someone shifts. The taste of the tea is sharp, made from stale leaves boiled too long, sometimes thickened with a pinch of coarse sugar if a guard is lenient or distracted. Often it is bitter, and the warmth is the only comfort it offers. Nearby, a battered iron pot sits propped on stones above glowing coals. The stew inside, thin and meager, water thickened with scraps of salted meat or a handful of beans. If the ration wagon did not run dry that week, conversation drifts among the circle in hushed murmurs. Memories traded like quiet coin, streets lit by lanterns back in London, the clatter of hooves on slick cobblestones, the flicker of a pub's hearth on a winter night. Someone hums a fragment of a song, voice low, words half swallowed by the hiss of the wind through the tall gums overhead. If you lean back now, shoulders pressed against a cold log, you might see how the road you helped carve cuts a faint, pale line through the dark forest, a wound in the land that will carry boots and wagons and stories for years to come. In that thin corridor, small lives slipped between the trees, heavy with iron ore, free for a breath before the next patrol comes looking. A man might lie awake here, counting the quiet sounds, the snap of bark as the fire shifts, the low whistle of the constable's breath as he dozes on his stump, musket propped against his knee. Far off, an owl calls once, then again, a soft, haunting note that settles into the hush like a question no one dares answer. Somewhere down the track U-shaped today, the land falls open to a shallow creek, its water moving dark and slow under the moon. It's there that some dream of slipping the chain, one man helping another file through the link, while the guard's back turns or his eyes grow heavy in the last hours before dawn. But for most, that dream dissolves by morning. The bush is wide, indifferent, full of shadows that confuse the unprepared. It hides no mercy for the hungry or the lost. And so the chain holds, two men bound at the ankle by iron, every step echoing in the hush as a soft reminder that the road leads onward only if the overseer wills it so. When the fire sinks to coals, voices fall quiet. One by one, men shift to lie on rough blankets if they have them, or curl directly onto hard ground if they do not. Boots serve as pillows. An old coat, traded or stolen, makes a blanket to pull up over sore shoulders. Above, the sky turns dark and deep and wide, a sweep of stars laid over the land like a silent ocean, unchanged by any hammer or spade. A few stare up into that sky, lids heavy, thoughts drifting. Some dream of home, though the shape of those streets grows soft. Let the hush of the chain gang's road settle behind you now. Follow instead the quiet rattle of tin plates and the soft scrape of spoons on rough wooden tables. The small, steady rituals of eating that filled bellies, just enough to swing an axe, haul a stone, survive another dawn. Picture a rough mess hall at the edge of a clearing, 4 crude walls of sawn timber, a roof patched with bark and tar. Inside, a long table runs the length of the room, its surface scarred with knife marks, notches, and the faint ghost of names, scratched by hands that once dreamed of London's crowded streets or Dublin's hidden courts. Men file in at dusk or before dawn's first light, shoulders damp from rain or sweat, boots crusted with red clay from the day's work. Each carries a battered tin plate or a wooden bowl, precious enough that some carve a mark or a shape into the rim to know it is theirs alone. At the head of the line stands a cook, perhaps a convict himself, trusted enough to ladle the portions but watched close enough to keep honesty within reach. Beside him, iron pots bubble over a low hearth, their contents a simple brew, boiled, salted meat, water thickened with a handful of oats or peas, if luck or shipment allows. The smell is strong but plain, salt, grease, the faint bitterness of weevil-bitten flour worked into flat bread or dumplings. Sometimes the bread comes half-burnt, the edges black, where the cook's tired eyes drifted away. Yet even the burnt crusts are precious. They vanish quickly under hungry hands. You sit on a rough bench, shoulders pressed against the man beside you. The tin spoon scrapes the bowl in a slow rhythm, bite by bite, a thin stew that clings to the sides as you chase every drop. Talk is low here, voices muffled by the clatter of tin. The hush of tired men who know there is little more waiting once the pot runs dry. Some meals bring small surprises, a scrap of fresh fish caught in the cove, if a net found luck, a twist of wild herbs picked by a trusted hand along the creek bank. Rare gifts, bright against the daily sameness, of salt pork and ship's biscuit gone soft in damp barrels. And always there is tea, black, bitter, boiled dark, in a dented pot that passes from cookhouse to clearing, sweetened if the sugar holds out, or else drunk plain, strong enough to chase the taste of brine and weevil away for a moment. When food runs short, bellies tighten, rations stretch thin, salt meat sliced thinner, biscuits rationed to crumbs, fresh flour replaced by coarse meal thick with grit. Hunger settles into the bones like an old, unwelcome companion, never leaving, just waiting for a moment's slip. Yet here, in this hush, over plates and tin cups, men share scraps of laughter, too. Old stories half remembered, jokes traded low to pass the time, while spoons scrape empty bowls. Sometimes, when the overseer's gaze softens, an extra crust finds its way into a pocket, carried carefully back to a mate waiting at the edge of camp. Outside, the night breathes quiet through the cracks in the walls. The smell of stew fades, replaced by the sharp temps of wood smoke and the distant hush of the sea. Tin bowls are stacked near the hearth, plates wiped clean with scraps of stale bread. A few men linger, warming hands over the coals before slipping back to thin blankets and rough cots. Tomorrow, the same meal will wait, the same salted meat, the same hard biscuit, the same hush of hungry men measuring each spoonful as if it might be the difference between one more day of work and the long, slow fade of a body too worn to stand. And so you drift from this small room, stepping out into the night where the hush of gum leaves and the low sigh of the wind fold around you, carrying with you the taste of salt and tea, the quiet promise that sometimes the smallest meal is enough to see the sun rise again. Stay a while longer in this quiet mess hall, this place of simple hunger where the taste of salt and weak tea weaves through every breath. Look closer at the faces bent over plates and battered mugs. Some are rough with stubble, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights on hard ground. Others are younger, cheeks still round from the softness of youth not yet worn thin by work and ration lines. Along the walls, sacks of flour slump in corners, tied with frayed rope. Beside them stand barrels marked in black tar. Salt pork pickled long before the ship ever left the Thames. Each barrel is a little lifeline, a promise that tomorrow's stew might fill the pot again. But the promise is always fragile. One spoiled shipment, one storm-delayed supply ship, and the barrels stand empty sooner than the ledger planned. A man near you leans back, licking a finger to sweep up the last film of grease from his tin plate. He does it without shame. Hunger smooths the edges of pride until only need remains. Another breaks the crust of a stale biscuit between cracked hands. He holds it to the lantern light, tapping out the tiny black weevils that sometimes nestle in the flour. No one turns away. They know this ritual too well. The quiet flick of fingernails, the soft sigh when the bread stays mostly whole. Sometimes the cook, when he dares, adds a pinch of dried herbs, a slip of green that carries the faint memory of fields far away, a reminder that flavor, once common as breath, has become a small, sharp miracle here. Now and then, a ration day brings a sweet taste almost too tender to name. A small wedge of cheese, pale and sweating at the edges from weeks at sea, or a dried fig, shriveled but rich with a memory of sun that feels impossibly distant to men who sweat under gum trees all day. Such gifts vanish in a heartbeat, a mouthful savored as if it might soften the next day's work. In some huts, trusted men are allowed to build rough clay ovens. When flour runs high and salt pork comes in fat slabs, they bake coarse loaves that smell warm and real for a few fleeting hours, crusts cracked and steaming, the rough crumb spread with a smear of fat scraped from the pot's edge. For a moment, a convict might feel like a baker again, not a number in a ledger. But the oven cools quickly. The next day, the bread goes stale, or mold creeps in on humid air, and the men return to biscuit and brine. Outside the mess hall, scraps feed the settlements, chickens, tough birds that scratch between stumps, pecking at crumbs too small for the men to claim. Let the taste of salt and stale bread fade now. Let the flicker of the mess hall lamps settle behind you as you drift backward across the sea, to the creaking decks of convict ships far from any safe shore. For before chains clinked on clearing roads or axes bit into eucalyptus trunks, the journey itself was a test of hope and desperation, and sometimes rebellion. Picture the dark belly of a transport ship rolling on a restless swell. The lantern sways overhead, throwing shadows that dance across rough beams, slick with salt and sweat. Below, convicts lie side by side in hammocks or on bare planks. The stale air clothes with the press of too many bodies and the soft coughs of men who dream of streets they may never see again. Above deck, the wind hums in the rigging. Sailors move like shadows, boots quiet on wet wood. An officer's voice murmurs now and then, orders barked low to keep the decks neat. The sails trimmed to catch every breath of wind that might push them closer to that far, unfamiliar shore. But deep in the hold, where the guards stand fewer and the iron sometimes rusts in salt air, other voices whisper, plans spoken softly in the hush between snores and the dull thud of waves against the hull. Not every man dreams of arrival. Some dream, instead of turning the ship back, of slipping the chains that bind them to a distant land they never chose. A mutiny on the high seas was no easy tale. The odds were thin, the risk vast, but still they rose. Little flickers of rebellion, sparked by hunger, by cruelty, by the simple, stubborn need to choose one's fate. Picture them now. Rough plans drawn in whispers, a stolen blade hidden in a shirt's torn hem, a length of rope tucked behind a barrel of salted beef, a signal agreed upon, a lantern covered at dusk, a cough in the hush, a footstep that means now. Sometimes the plan never came alive at all. A traitor's whisper in the night brought the guards. The irons tightened, the ringleaders dragged up into the thin daylight, chained in the bow where every man could see how hope was punished when it spoke too loud. Yet a few times, just a few, the plan flared into action. Knives drawn in the dark, the soft thud of boots on deck as prisoners rose from the hold, eyes wide and wild with the taste of sudden air. A watchman overpowered by sheer numbers, the crew roused from bunks to stand back to back with cutlasses bare, salt spray wetting bare arms and faces. A mutiny might last an hour, a night, or no more than a single heartbeat before the muskets barked. Some ships changed course for a moment before the revolt broke apart in confusion, and the old routine settled back in like a heavy blanket. Once, they say, a convict crew did seize a ship, the Cypress, in a wild slip of daring. They steered her away from Van Diemen's Land, hoping to vanish into the maze of southern seas and find a new shore where no chains could follow. Their flight was short-lived, the sea's wide hush proving less forgiving than their hope. but their names linger still, a small legend traded in the cramped bunks of transport ships that followed. Even when these revolts failed, and fail they did, again and again, they left behind a spark, a hush that said, "It can be done." And in that whisper, some men found enough warmth to hold on through the weeks ahead, through ration lines, salt pork, the sharp bark of the lash, the endless creak of timbers on dark water. Tonight, if you listen closely, you might hear that hush still, the low breath of hope spoken in secret below the waves, the sound of boots on deck at midnight, the faint clink of iron shifting as a man leans close to ask, "Could we?" And then the sea sighs back, washing the decks clean, carrying secrets away on a tide no iron chain could ever bind completely. Stay here a moment longer, listening to the creak and sigh of the ship as it drifts through black water under pale stars. Let the sway of the lantern above calm you, the way it swings in a soft arc, scattering shadows across rough planks and bare feet. In the hold, the air is close, thick with the warmth of bodies packed tight together, the damp breath of men who cannot remember what fresh wind feels like on skin unchained. You hear a cough, the rustle of straw, the low scrape of iron against wood as someone shifts his weight in his sleep. Somewhere in this hush, the whisper of a plan threads its way through the darkness. Two men lean close, knees touching. One fingers the rusted iron link that binds his ankle to another's wrist. He imagines the ocean just beyond the hull, so close he can taste the salt on his tongue, feel it prickling his hair where sweat beads at his brow. They speak in half-formed words, careful not to let hope ring too clear in the stale air. Hope, after all, is a dangerous thing down here, where the guards move with loaded pistols at their hips and a short rope ready for necks that forget who owns them. Yet sometimes the guards drift to they grow careless on long nights, when the wind hums steady and the sea shows no teeth. They nod at their posts, muskets balanced on tired knees, a moment's weakness. That is all the men below need to fan a spark into flame. Imagine them now, a smuggled blade made from a sharpened scrap of iron stashed behind a water barrel, a small hammer stolen from the carpenter's kit, hidden beneath a bunk where the ship's rats come to gnaw at crumbs. Each piece of this quiet rebellion is ordinary, harmless, alone. Together, they are something more dangerous than salt spray and storm clouds combined. Above deck, the sailors watch the stars, the same stars that once guided ships to colonies half a world away now seem to look down in mute witness. If a mutiny rises, it rises under these same silent lights, the moon a cold witness to every soft footstep, every whispered promise of freedom. Sometimes the plan never lives beyond the hush, a slip of the tongue at dawn, a boast made too loudly over a ration of stale biscuit. A man tempted by the promise of leniency trades the secret for a softer post on deck, a bigger share of brine-soaked pork. And then the ringleaders are dragged up, blinking into sunlight they'd hoped to greet as free men. Their hands are bound behind their backs, instead, wrists raw where the rope. Step ashore now, leaving the creak of timbers and the salt hush of the sea behind. Walk inland, past the muddy clearings and rough stockades, until you find the edge of a settlement, where the thin line of huts gives way to bracken and dry grass that rustles in the wind. Here you will find small markers, simple wooden crosses, a pile of stones, a patch of earth sunken slightly from the weight of years. These are the resting places of those who did not last the voyage, or the first harsh winters, or the fever that swept through damp barracks when the rains came too soon. They called them burial grounds, but many were no more than paddocks borrowed from the bush, cleared just enough to hold the rows. No marble, no grand carving, just rough timber, split and nailed. Sometimes carved with a name if a friend or a brother risked the overseer's eye to mark. The wood before the grave settled back into silence. Imagine a man standing by a shallow pit at dawn, hat in hand, eyes lowered. He might be overseer or convict, preacher or mate. Perhaps he knew the dead man's crime, or the story he told of streets half a world away. Or perhaps he knew nothing but a name muttered in the mess hall, a cough heard in the dark, a shiver that turned to stillness before the first call of the rooster's crow. Sometimes they buried them at night, the freshly dead carried under a quiet moon to the edge of the clearing. A few rough words spoken, a cross hammered in. The earth pressed back down with the same shovels that cut ditches and turned roads by day. No family wept there, not in the way they did in churchyards back in England or Ireland. No stone angels kept watch. No fences or gates marked where the bush began and the burying ground ended. Over time, the scrub crept back, roots tangled through the simple markers. Possums scuttled over mounds, now softened by seasons of rain and sun. Yet these graves spoke, in their hush, of what it meant to carve a colony from unforgiving soil. How many slipped through the cracks of ledgers and lists, lost to fever or hunger, a slipped axe blade, a fall from a wagon, a bite of bad meat. Their stories drifted into the wind with the dust of the road gangs and the steam from the cookhouse pots. Years later, settlers built fences nearby. Sheep grazed where the old crosses once leaned. Children found bits of pottery or a rusted nail where a coffin hinge gave way to time. Some graves faded until no one living could say who lay beneath the tangle of dry grass and shadows. Yet if you stand there in the hush at dusk, the last light catching the edge of the bush, you might feel the soft echo of the lives once carried across the sea in chains and salt dreams. You might hear the faint breath of wind through the gum trees overhead, the same trees that bent quietly to watch the first convicts push spades into stubborn earth. Tonight, imagine your footsteps here, slow and respectful, between crooked markers, half sunk into clay. Each step a small remembrance, each breath a promise that, though names fade, the hush that holds them remains. So let the breeze move gently through the grass. Let the earth keep its secrets kindly. Let the forgotten graves rest where the wild roots weave through bone and memory, returning what was once bound in iron to the quiet patience of the land. Stay here a little longer, among the rough grass and leaning markers, where the hush lies thicker than anywhere else. Listen to the wind as it moves through scrub that grows where rows of wooden crosses once stood straight in raw earth. If you walk slowly, you might see how the years have pressed these places back into the land. Timber splintered by rain, nails rusted to flakes. Some crosses lean so far they seem to bow to the roots that curl beneath them. Others have no mark left at all, the soft grain eaten away by termites or rot, the names they once held swallowed back into the soil. And yet, if you pause long enough, it feels as if these small plots still breathe stories back into the dusk. Stories not of grand battles or famous deeds, but of small, ordinary ends that once felt so sharp to those who watched the final breath drift into the chill dawn air. Picture a young man lowered into a shallow grave by hands no older than his own. Shipmates who once shared a crust of stale biscuit on a rolling deck, now pressing clay over his chest with spades dulled by years of hacking roads. A muttered prayer, rough and brief, half remembered from childhood Sundays far away, spoken into wind that carried it off before it reached the tree line. Nearby, a woman lies beneath a tangle of vines, her grave marked only by a scrap of iron, hammered crooked into a fence post when the settlement's stockyard crept too close. Perhaps she was once a washerwoman at the female factory, her hands raw from soap and river mud. Perhaps she dreamed once of streets paved with more than gravel and gossip, a small garden, a child's laugh that didn't echo off stone walls. Over the years, cattle brushed past these places, hooves tamping the earth flatter, pressing stone chips deeper with each slow grazing step. Sometimes children picked wildflowers from fence lines and left them on mounds. They didn't fully understand, tiny gifts that stayed only until the next breeze carried their petals away. And still the graves remained, unmarked or half-marked, names worn soft like old cloth. Sometimes a lone caretaker, an overseer's widow, a settler's daughter, came with hammer and nails to write a leaning cross, to clear bramble just enough that the wood might stand another season before the bush claimed it again. If you stand at the edge of this clearing now, dusk thickening around your shoulders, you might notice the soft chorus that gathers here, not voices, not words, but the layered hush of wind, leaf, and the steady pulse of the earth reclaiming what iron once bound. The same soil that swallowed footprints of chain gangs, the same soil that once caught the salted tears of men and women, half forgotten by the ships that carried them here. And so they rest, these lost names, these small, stubborn souls who did not cross oceans to be remembered in books, but who built the paths, the walls, the clearings that still shape the country's bones today. Each mound, each marker, a quiet testament to labor and loss, hope and hunger. So linger here for a breath longer. Let your footsteps fade into the hush. Leave no mark but a soft imprint in the grass that will vanish by morning. And as you step away, carry with you this gentle truth. Sometimes the stories that slip beneath, let the hush of those graves soften now as you drift forward through the slow unfolding of years. Imagine the rough clearings growing into streets, dirt tracks lined with tents, then huts, then cottages, roofed with weathered shingles and iron sheeting. The muddy pathways pressed into roads by boots and wagon wheels. The old stockades swallowed by stone walls and neat fences. What began as a penal camp, raw and restless on the edge of a wide, unknown land, settled slowly into a town, then a town into a city. Sydney, Hobart, Newcastle, each a small knot of hard beginnings bound by iron, salt, and sweat, now stretching outward with soft lamps that flicker where once only the moon shone on clearing fires. Picture the ghost of a chain gang's road beneath modern tarmac, the faint echo of a quarry's hammer hidden under suburbs of neat gardens and flowering hedges. The graves lie under schools and parks now, their markers long vanished, but their hush carried in the wind that sighs through old gum trees, still standing watch beside playground fences and city lawns. Imagine a cottage built of sandstone blocks, first shaped by men who swung picks under guard, blocks now worn smooth by rain and time, tucked between office towers and shops, humming with voices that rarely pause to remember who once chipped at their corners. The convict's mark is there if you know where to look. A small chisel cut in the stone, a date half buried by creeping moss. Some stories drift more softly than others. A name in a ledger here, a scrap of a letter there, a line that hints at a child born on shipboard, a woman who earned her freedom tending sheep on borrowed land, a man who vanished into the bush and left behind only rumors and an old road bearing his name. In this hush, the city sleeps lightly atop all that came before, the same soil, the same water, the same salt wind that once filled sails and chapped the lips of men too weary to lift their heads. Beneath street lamps and traffic lights, the hush of that old colony breathes on, in the way footsteps echo on sandstone steps, in the slow rustle of paper in an archive box, in the hush of waves that still wash the same worn shores. And for you, resting now, eyes soft behind your lids, breath deepening with the quiet rhythm of a story winding toward its end. This long hush carries a simple comfort that every road, every table, every quiet graveyard holds its piece of a larger story, one built of hard days and harder hopes. A story of beginnings that grew into something vast and sprawling and alive. So let your mind drift here, among the old stones hidden under the city's new bones. Let the creak of chains fade, the hush of waves soften, the footsteps grow still. The colony sleeps now, not forgotten, not gone, but settled deep in the roots that hold the city upright while you rest. Somewhere out there, the surf still whispers against sandstone cliffs. The gum trees sway in the dark, just as they did when the first campfires glowed along the cove. And above it all, the night sky holds the Southern Cross steady, just as it did for those first souls who dreamed of home while standing on the edge of a world that asked them to endure, to bend, to build, and, when the hush came, to sleep. So breathe slowly now. Let the hush of early Australia settle around you like soft earth over forgotten roots. Imagine yourself lighter than iron, softer than the hammer's echo, drifting in the space between past and present. When you wake, the roads will be here. The trees will stand watch. The city will hum over old stones and lost names, steady, patient, and always waiting to tell you another quiet story when next you drift this way again. Sleep well.